Revelation 1825. From the 23rd of February 1941. Must state. Light, influence on unredeemed. The light of the Spirit penetrates into every matter, that is, the spiritual that is sheltered in matter is constantly influenced by the spiritual outside of matter to do what has to lead to salvation. Thus the spiritual outside of matter is controlled by God's will or, to put it more accurately, submits to divine will. It will therefore exert the influence as God determines. The spiritual in matter, which is still in the beginning of its development, is therefore incumbent upon this spiritual, and the latter now carries out what the mature spiritual wants. This is the compulsory state which every being has to go through before it receives its free will as a human being, but at the same time the mature spiritual makes the still undeveloped aware of its compulsive state in the banished form and stimulates it to activity. For the being is then tormented by the lightless stay in the solid form, and when a light being breaks through this darkness and sends a glimmer of light to the spiritual being in the form, the desire for light is awakened in the being, and then it also willingly carries out what is demanded of it, and thus loosens the cover somewhat. The spirit can now already enter into contact with the spiritual outside much more easily. Light is therefore both a means and an end. To influx light is to make one hungry for light, to desire light is to fulfill it. For light is given to the desiring being. The love which unites the eternal deity with its living creations is evident from the fact that they can let the will become active within themselves, that is, although in form they only carry out divine will. It is nevertheless of great advantage for the being if its own will is already the same as divine will while it is still in a state of compulsion. Such a being will cover the earthly course much more successfully, it will be able to leave every form again after a short stay, since it willingly carries out what means redemption for the being. However, in what way the mature spiritual assists the banished spiritual is difficult to explain. These are spiritual currents which every work of creation must feel and which now bring the slumbering spiritual to awaken. Only the completely unruly spiritual substance remains in its God-opposing will, and therefore its external form is still very hard, so that even the love of mature spiritual entities is unable to break the rigid mind, since the light only very rarely shimmers for the being which remains in opposition to God, and therefore the rigid mind cannot easily be broken to its own sorrow, for due to its lack of light it does not recognize that help is available for the immature being and therefore does not desire this help of its own accord either. For this reason it is often forcibly roused from its stubbornness, so that in a state of temporary freedom it now becomes acquainted with the advantage of a free state and then strives all the more eagerly for light. Thus the spiritually mature forces now have access and can successfully influence the banished spiritual being accordingly, so that it now eagerly complies with what is demanded of it, and the hardness of the form around it now begins to diminish considerably. Now the liberation from these forms takes place relatively quickly, and the Spirit out of God has unhindered access to the spiritual hiding in matter which yearns for redemption. Amen.